Well, good evening and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. You know, before I get into tonight's opening remarks, I do want to tell you a very brief anecdote that relates to why you're sitting down here tonight. I was at several holiday parties the last couple of weeks, and on more than one occasion, somebody would buttonhole me and say, "Aren't you that library guy?" And I said, "Well, I really go by Henry, but you can call me the library guy if you want." Say, I have a question for you. What is it that goes into the determination of when do you hold events at Central and when do you hold events at Plaza? And what about when you have them downstairs or upstairs, and what's going on with that? And I said, well, it's all a matter of how we think things are going to work. If we think we're going to get 100, 150 people, we like to do it at the Central Library upstairs in Hellsberg Auditorium. If we think we're going to get 200, 250 people, we like to do it at the Truman Forum Auditorium in the Plaza branch. So he says, so how come sometimes we end up downstairs? And I said, at Central. And I said, because I miscalculated. So, I never realized there would be so much interest in the year 1939, and I'm thrilled that you share my interest in this year and the 75th anniversary of all of the things that took place in 1939. Because this is the first, this is the formal inauguration, if you will, of an occasional series of programs that we'll be offering throughout 2014 that are intended to mark or commemorate or explain or possibly even reinterpret the 75th anniversaries of many of the momentous events that took place in, as I've come to think of it, the year the world went to hell. To give you an idea of what to expect, here's the lineup thus far. In March, we'll be looking at the 75th anniversary of the conclusion of the Spanish Civil War, which, as you know, saw the triumph of the fascist forces under Nationalist General Francisco Franco. In September, we'll revisit the German invasion of Poland, the formal beginning of the Second World War. And in December, we'll have a talk on the oft-forgotten Winter War, the Russian invasion of Finland that gave us the Fighting Finns and the Molotov cocktail. Of course, history is messy. Not everything from 1939 fits neatly into the rubric that Winston Churchill famously termed the gathering storm. Hollywood had its best year ever, which we are also demonstrating this year at the Central Library throughout 2014 in our Film Vault with our Saturday afternoon movie series. We're showing the best movies ever presented in 1939. Also, the 1939 New York World's Fair, with its vision of the world of tomorrow, opened in the spring of that year. We're bringing in the world's greatest expert on the history of World's Fairs, Dr. Robert Rydell of Montana State University. He's giving us an original talk on that iconic international exposition. And for sports fans, 1939 saw the retirement of Lou Gehrig from the Yankees. I've got a lead on somebody to give a talk about that as well. Information about all of these programs can be found in our monthly calendars, our weekly email blasts, and of course on our website. If you're not on our mailing list and you're not receiving this material, please sign up afterwards. We'd love to add you, because 2014 will be a great year to remember 1939 at the Kansas City Public Library. And to tell us why we should reacquaint ourselves with this incredibly significant year, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hal Wert, Professor of History at the Kansas City Art Institute. Hal has produced for us a completely original talk titled 1939, Into the Abyss, a task for which he is extremely well equipped. Hal earned his graduate degrees at the University of Kansas, studying under Ted Wilson, one of the leading historians, one of the leading authorities on 20th century military and diplomatic history. Hal has followed in Ted's footsteps. He has written several books and dozens of articles and reviews in both scholarly and popular publications, including the Journal of Military History, the Military Review, History Today, and Armchair General. Hal and I have been talking about this program for about 6 or 7 months. I think that what he's cooked up for you is going to be quite the treat. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hal Wert.
Actually, you're all victims of a conspiracy. We have been plotting this for the last 6 months, and you've made the conspiracy possible. I appreciate so many of you coming up on a cold night in January to deal with this. What's interesting, you know, Winston Churchill called this the gathering storm, but 1939 produces the storm of war. And we'll get into that a little more, but you know, after the war starts, it really backs off for a while. So in fact, nothing much happens in the war besides the Winter War that starts on November 30th, 1939, until the following spring. Everybody's waiting to see what Hitler's going to do. But let's go back and start with 1939, what actually happens. Up on your screen is a picture of the victory parade in Prague after the Germans, I guess, disassembled is the best way to put it, the state of Czechoslovakia. But before that, the new year starts out right away with the Spanish Civil War. And we'll look at some particular slides. I should tell you something, too, about the slides. For the last 40 years, I've been a maniac poster collector, and I have a huge collection of relief posters from World War II. And if my agent's on the ball, he should have sold the book, hopefully this week, called Aiming at the Heart of America, the Relief Posters and Relief Agencies of the Second World War. So many of these posters are very rare and have been dug out of archives all over the United States, and even some in Europe. I've dug some nice ones, both in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic. So what happens in January, right after the turn of the year? And actually 4 days from today, Barcelona fell. And it's the beginning of the end of the Spanish Republic. Right after that, we'll take a look. There were many agencies in America, particularly on the left. You know, this is a war between the left and the right. And even though some conservative Catholics backed Franco, a majority of New Yorkers and leftists in America supported the Spanish Civil War. Abraham Lincoln Brigade, George Washington Brigade were volunteers, and there were many efforts to aid the war. This is one of them, Save Me, I'm Too Young to Die. We'll take a look. This is by Rockwell Kent. This is a very rare poster. Rockwell Kent did as much as he could as an artist in the 1930s to support the Spanish Republican government. This comes in also in a white version, but this one I found this one in Columbia University in the Butler Library, folded up. They have a lot of great posters, but all of them are folded up. They've not preserved them properly, which I try to get them to do. This is Rockwell Kent's billboard in downtown New York City. So what happens after the fall of Barcelona? By the end of February, Britain and France both recognize the new Spanish government under Franco. But Madrid has not fallen yet. And it's another 30 days before Madrid falls and the Spanish Civil War is over. One of the reasons it's so important, in many ways, it's like a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. The forces are lined up there. How does Franco win? He has some support both from aircraft and from ground troops from both Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. So the war is extremely important. Now, I have a controversial take on the war. I'm not so sure. I should say this, too. I love counterfactuals because they're analytical tools. But my basic rule for history is if frogs had wings, they wouldn't bump their butt when they hopped. So this is a frogs have wings thesis. What if the communists had won in Spain, and what would that have meant for World War II and an alliance with the Soviet Union, and how might it have reshaped the Cold War? Now, I can't answer that question, but it's fun to think about. So in the long run, it may not have been so bad that Franco, this is a choice of two evils, that Franco won the war, because he contributed very little to Germany during the war. He did commit the Blue Division. Maybe 200,000 Spaniards fought on the Eastern Front, and of course a tremendous number of them were killed on the Eastern Front. But during the war, too, we also provided Spain with aviation fuel and with milk for children to try to decouple them from the Nazis. So it worked out reasonably well, maybe the best it might have been possible given the situations. We'll take a look at a couple of others here. I've always liked this poster. The reason my name is on the posters is when I send these out and that sort of thing, I have a research assistant who lives in Chicago, who graduated from the Chicago Art Institute and from the Kansas City Art Institute, and we photograph them all at 600 ppi or better. And when I send them out, I don't want people to steal them. That's why my names are on them, because I've got a significant investment in them. But in any event, I've always liked this poster too. And you know, we sent ships, or the left sent ships, and I thought you'd like this one very much. These are Kansas City girls that are in the process of raising milk for Spanish children right here in Kansas City. So the war is not one that doesn't permeate to the depths of America across the entire country. Now, we'll talk about this. March 15th. Look, we've just concluded the Spanish Civil War. Madrid is not fallen. The Munich Agreement is violated on March 15th, 1939. What the devil is the Munich Agreement? Well, Hitler had demanded the Sudetenland, which is a part of Czechoslovakia, of Western Czechoslovakia, and mostly populated by Germans. Hitler's argument, one of the ways he came to power in the 1930s and afterwards was able to get away with the acquisition of territory, is that he argued the Treaty of Versailles was unfair. And many people in Great Britain and many people in France and many people in America bought that argument. Again, I'm not so sure how solid that argument is, but it was one that was very effective at the time. The reason I question it, if you look at the German treaty that they signed at Brest-Litovsk with the Russians after their victory in World War I on the Eastern Front, it's way harsher than the Treaty of Versailles. So why would they think, you know, that they didn't have particular things coming? There are historians, too, who think the reparations were not excessive. But that's in the public imagination, and it's an important factor in the rise of Hitler. He argued, ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer. You know, one state, one people, all Germans inside Germany. Well, up until after the Sudetenland, that was true. But on March 15th, when he violates the Munich Agreement, he's taken Czechs. They're not Germans. Everybody knows the game is up. Everybody knows that Hitler's ambitions are practically unlimited. How far he will go, nobody knows. So Britain and France's first reaction is, you know, we might have stood up earlier. Appeasement is a policy. Chamberlain's policy is not working. We need to make a commitment to the Poles. Hitler begins to put the pressure on Poland and Lithuania immediately after disassembling Czechoslovakia. So the first reaction is, okay, how can we defend Poland? And I think the answer for both the British and the French, who don't want to do this, who would prefer not to, who would like to avoid the war, is we don't think that Hitler will plunge all of Europe into war. We have to take a calculated risk. So they draw what I would call a line in the sand. They make a military commitment to Poland, both Britain and France. And if you look at the map, the only real way that Poland can be aided immediately, since it's surrounded by lots of parts of Germany, including East Prussia, would be for the French to crash across the German border. And the French simply lack the will. I think we can understand that. If you saw the article that was in the Sunday Star magazine, maybe some of you did, I did reluctantly draw some comparisons between now and 1939. I'm always loath to do that as a historian because, of course, I'm not an expert on now, but I know a lot more about 1939. So what were the comparisons? Well, I think we can have some empathy for this. Is America in recession? Yes. Are we peaking out of recession as America and the British and the French were in 1939? The answer is yes. Are we tired of war? Have we had 10 years of war? Is there any will in America to deal with Iran or Syria? And my answer is no. Welcome to 1939. Now, I'm not arguing that this is going to be followed. I do not have a crystal ball. So I'm not arguing this is going to be followed by catastrophe. And I'm not arguing that Barack Obama is Neville Chamberlain. But Fox News might think so. No, all right. Maybe, I don't know. But, you know, it's unpredictable. But you can see that there are similarities and have some empathy for the British and the French. It's easy now to say, well, why didn't you guys do something about this? Now, remember, they also remember World War I, and so do Americans. This is only 25 years later. World War I and World War II are very, very, very different wars. World War I, there are 10 million people killed in World War I, but most of them are combatants between 17 and 50 years old. The creme de la creme of Germany, Russia, France, Great Britain's men are killed in that war, mostly in trench warfare, as you know, across the face of Europe. But World War I, in many ways, I know there's some campaigns in the Far East, some campaigns that take place in Africa, but it's really not a world war. It's not a total war. Because very few civilians, except on the Eastern Front. There are exceptions. There are a number of civilians that are killed on the Eastern Front, but not on the Western Front. But with the gas, you know, there's the feeling, too, that World War I, well, I should interrupt for 1 minute. One of the things I like about Henry and I doing World War II for the next 6 or 7 months is we're in direct competition with the 100th anniversary of World War I. So the year 2014 is a big year for history. But in any event, the memories are terrible from the war. The casualties are terrible from the war. And people don't want another one. So there's tremendous public opposition, both in France, Great Britain, and the United States, to any involvement in World War II. We'll come back to America a little later, but even during the Battle of Britain in August 1940, 90% of all Americans support Great Britain in the war, and 70% say, it's not our war. And this is in August 1940. So Franklin Roosevelt, of course, has the great challenge, starting in 1937 and 38, to try to educate and lead America to a defensive position because he can see not only the gathering storm, but the potential for the storm of war. Chamberlain, in 1938, is invited by Hitler to come to Munich and deal with the Czech crisis. And he does. He comes back, and this, of course, has come to haunt him. This is the famous picture of of Chamberlain waving a piece of paper in his hand that says, "Peace in our time." I wonder if we're going to come back from Syria that way in a couple of weeks. I don't know. Maybe. But you get the idea here. of what's going on. And of course, appeasement now is a nasty word and became so, of course, in Great Britain and later in the United States and after the war. And we learn a lesson from it. Now, I'm not one who thinks that history necessarily teaches hard lessons. We can talk about that too a little bit. But the hard lesson is you need to stand up to aggression and nip it in the bud. If only we, the West, had stood up to Hitler in 1935 when he occupied the Rhineland, things would be different today. Well, they would, but they could be worse. And so there was opportunity after opportunity after opportunity for the West to stand up to Hitler. It might have been wise to do it earlier because the British and French army were actually in better shape than the German army. It really didn't get off the ground until 1934-35, so it gave them time to produce a lot more weapons. People have argued, too, that Chamberlain's sellout of the Czechs, you know, he made that famous statement that haunted him for the rest of his life, that the Czechs were a far distant people of whom the British knew little. This is, you know, and he argued too, he said, why should we, let me do the quote a little better. He said, why should we be digging trenches in Great Britain for a distant people of whom we know little? And it seems to me that's a haunting refrain on the Middle East at this point as well, and the aspirations of millions of people in the Middle East. We can talk about that later too, if you like the question and answer period. So in any event, the British make the commitment. It's a line in the sand. And now everybody's waiting to see what Hitler's going to do. What happens, we'll come back and talk about culture later, but it's amazing that just after this, about 60 days after this, a little less, the World's Fair opens. So there's this great irony that exists in 1939 between what's actually happening and aspirations of people in the rest of the Western world and what they hope will happen. So what happens after that? Well, this is before the war starts on September 1st. There's a series of conflicts that historians have not paid enough attention to. There are a few. Alvin D. Cox at Stanford did a 2-volume history. How many of you know where No Mun Han is? And only a few people in the entire audience know where No Mun Han is. Well, it's on the Manchukuo border. The Japanese, of course, had taken over Manchuria, created a puppet state with Henry Puyi in 1933. They had been one of the first powers to walk out of the League of Nations. The Italians walked out of the League of Nations, and then the Germans walked out of the League of Nations. So by 1939, the League of Nations is essentially impotent, as if it had any power in the first place. But in any event, this is on the Russian Manchurian, or Manchukuo, as the Japanese called it, border. And the conflict starts in June with a series of skirmishes. But by August, it's a full-pitched battle. And what's important about it is that the Russians won it. And the general that was in charge of operations was General Zhukov, who later was the great victor in the Battle of Moscow and led the Russians to victory on the Eastern Front in the West. But he used armor divisions, and he used combined warfare for one of the first times. He used 4 armor divisions, 2 regiments, 6 infantry divisions. This is a major campaign. And he used air, infantry, artillery coordination, which is difficult to do. Military historians out here will know the difficulties of combined warfare. But for the Japanese, it's a great lesson. Were the Japanese going to go north, or were they going to go south? And after this stunning defeat, actually there were only 2 Japanese infantry divisions that were surrounded by this huge force and then essentially liquidated. So what was the response of the Japanese to this? It's too dangerous to go north. I've always wondered, you know, because of the Russo-Finnish War, we'll get to that, Hitler concluded that in fact Poland and the West was nothing but a house of cards. He made the comment that all you had to do was kick in the door and the whole thing. This is what he said about the Soviet Union. All you had to do was kick in the door and the whole thing would collapse. But his intelligence should have picked up the importance of that battle. The Japanese at that point decide it's easier to go south and it's easier to attack the Allied powers, Britain and France particularly, and their colonies, because they're going to be busy in the West with Hitler. So in fact, it's a turning point, and a critical turning point, because of course, how does America get into the war? Not because of Adolf Hitler. We get into the war because of the Japanese and attack at Pearl Harbor. So in a way, our entry into the war in Europe is a kind of backdoor to war. I'm a little loath to use that term because two famous American historians in the 1940s, one of them wrote a book called The Backdoor to War, but he's arguing for a kind of conspiracy on Roosevelt's part, which I don't think is the case. So No Moon Han, I think a book came out about a year ago. I've not seen it, a new one, but it's worth taking a look at. And what's happening, of course, in 1939 is that events in the Far East and events in Europe are coming together to produce World War II. The storm of war. But it's a slow process. Another thing we should talk about a minute too, the war in the Far East until the last 4 or 5 years, particularly the Japanese war in China, has not had due historical attention. It's been neglected. That's starting to radically change. There are 4 or 5 new books out in the last 3 or 4 years. One of them says that the battle for Shanghai in 1937 was as vicious and had as many troops involved as Stalingrad. I think it's time to rethink the China-Japan war and even its importance for how modern China reacts in the world. Maybe over the Spratly Islands, rising tensions in East Asia can be directly tied, I think, back to the conflict in World War II. But there are some good new books out on this. Chiang Kai-shek is looking better, believe it or not. You know, there's a tendency to write him off. He became a kind of joke. You know, General Stilwell called him Shanker Jack. He sang songs that said Shanker Jack is Piss Boo How, using Chinese. So there was never a good relationship. But there's been a tendency for us to believe Stilwell, and all the new evidence coming out suggests that may not be the case. That Chiang Kai-shek, while he was not an ideal leader, did better, and the Chinese army did better against the Japanese than they've been given credit for. That's also happening, too, with a kind of revision about the war in Vietnam, where the ARVNs are looking a little better than we thought they were at the time. History's beginning to shift a little bit. We're far enough away from it that we can be a little more objective. So in any event, I think this gives you a good sense of why the Munich crisis is so important. Can they get ready in time? Will Hitler attack Poland? Will he plunge Europe into war? What happens after No Moon Han? This is August. August 24th, August 25th. An unbelievable thing happens. Hitler decides to send his foreign minister to the Soviet Union and ask for a non-aggression pact between the two countries and cut a deal with Stalin that he can have the eastern part of Poland if he allows Hitler to take the western part. They also decide in secret protocol what to do with Bessarabia. They decide what to do with the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Those countries only got their independence in 1919. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles created a series of new states. Remember, Woodrow Wilson posited the idea of the self-determination of nations. Now, I have some admiration for Woodrow Wilson, and many of his ideas are brilliant, but one of the worst ideas ever conceived by man is self-determination of nations. Because it's not based on pluralism, it's based on ethnicity. And when you broke up the old empires, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, there were too many selves to be self-determined. They were mixed in cities. And so the only solution would be to move millions of people. The only place that happened was between Greece and Turkey in 1923, and it was a disaster. And the only place between Greece and Turkey it didn't happen was Cyprus. And what is the status of Cyprus today? It's divided in half. One half belongs to the European Union, and the other half is protected by the Turks. The Turks wanted to join the European Union. The Europeans don't want them. Erdogan has gone on a kind of moderate policy independently in the Middle East. So I think there's some connections there. You know, let's do this quickly, but let's take Poland, for example. Poland now is 95% Catholic. But how it got there is an unbelievable historical tragedy. What happens in Eastern Europe, actually starting earlier in the early 1800s, is one long series of ethnic cleansings that continue back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, particularly as the forces of nationalism rise in the 19th century. So this becomes a difficult problem. How did Poland get that way? In 1939, Poland is 33% German. It has the largest Jewish population of any country in Europe. What does it have in 1945? The Jewish population has been killed, essentially. A few have escaped. The Germans have all been driven out. Remember, at the end of World War II, there's a huge ethnic cleansing that we approve of as the Russians move to the west and drive out various ethnic groups, and particularly the Germans. Germans had been migrating out into Central Europe since the 12th and 13th century. Volksdeutsch. And all of the Volksdeutsch are actually driven out. And East Prussia is gone as well. So that's a tragedy we can talk a bit about as well. So Hitler called those states, he didn't think any of them stood a snowball's chance in hell, to quote Henry. And the world is going to hell. And Hitler called them Saison states. States for a season, states that had no future. And of course, the Russians had given away huge territory at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk to have socialism in one country under Trotsky and Lenin. And so now here's a chance on August 23rd, 1939, August 23rd and 24th. The agreement takes place just after midnight in the Kremlin. An interesting conference to get that territory back. And that's what they do. They split up Eastern Europe between themselves. Lithuania actually is given to Estonia, and Latvia are in the Russian sphere. Lithuania goes to Germany in the sphere. Eastern Poland and Bessarabia both go to the Soviet Union. Now, why did Hitler do this? And you know, it's a shock because it's the right and the left, particularly after the Spanish Civil War, the left can't imagine that the Soviet Union would cut a deal with the fascists and with Hitler. And they do. And it is a shocking event for the entire world to see these two dictatorships get together. Stalin takes it much more seriously than Hitler does. And in fact, all the way up to Barbarossa, which takes place in June of 1941, he honors that agreement. It's ironic that, you know, Manchukuo, I don't think a lot of people know this, but there's a lot of trade. And sometimes if you're getting ready to go to war with someone, two people are getting ready to go to war, they need each other's help to be able to do it. And that's exactly what's going on with the Soviet Union and with Germany. Most of the soybean crop in Manchukuo is sold to the Germans and comes on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And comes to Germany. Where did Germany get most of the gasoline that was in its tanks when it invaded Poland and the Soviet Union? From Russia. So there's trade going on all up until the last minute. I think just 6 hours before Barbarossa started, the last Soviet train came into Germany with supplies. Now there's trade going the other way as well. So this is a deal. Stalin sees this as a way for him to survive. And Hitler sees this as a way to prevent a two-front war. You know, Hitler's haunted by the idea. Of course, this isn't going to work out for him. He ends up fighting a three-front war. But, you know, he's haunted by the idea of the two-front war during World War I. And so this is an opportunity to try to avoid that. Well, he's used the same tactic that he's used repeatedly. Take a smaller power, isolate them, and deal with them one-on-one. Germany's twice as big, twice the size. You know, I think after World War II, we play a really important role in forming the European Union. And one of the reasons why, of course, is the European Union was important to us, as well as getting Europeans together. It was a solution to the German problem. By putting the Germans, dividing Germany in half in 1945, and putting the Germans into a European Union, the Lilliputians got to tie down Gulliver. Now, of course, Gulliver's radically changed, but this has always been the problem in Europe, the German problem, German unification. And the reason why, when Germany's unified, all Germans are in one state. They're the biggest, most powerful state in Europe by definition. Who's the most powerful state in the European Union? Germany. And what if the Austrians joined them? So you see what I mean? There's the potential there historically. This is France's historical problem. It's only usually Britain's problem if they're worried about Belgium or worried about France, because of course Great Britain always turned its back on Europe. and built its empires out in the world. As you know, 3 different empires at 3 different periods of history in the world. How many of you have ever been to Waterloo to see the Battle of Waterloo? Any of you? One of the wonderful things there is that there's a big British lion, and that's on the battlefield, and it has its rear end turned to Britain, and it's growling towards Europe. There's a little message there. All right? There's a little message there. You know, don't screw with Great Britain is the message, or you'll end up at a Waterloo, but worried about that situation. So Hitler plays this astutely. He thinks that when he puts the heat on Poland in 1939, the British and the French will not declare war. They're bluffing. And you know, there's a lot, he's not crazy. He may be crazy overall, but he's not crazy. He's not particularly crazy in this judgment. This is a hot debate. They may not. And of course, he sends out all the warning signals. He calls the Polish ambassador in and says essentially, he does a casus belli, to use the Latvian. He makes up all kinds of excuses that are not true about what the Poles have done to him, how the Poles have mistreated the German minority. Now, there isn't any doubt in Silesia, some of the German minority was mistreated. And you're going to think that, well, I don't know if you'll think this is funny or not, that's Woodrow Wilson's fault. All right. Because he helped create a Poland that was based on, ethnic exclusivity. And when the Poles get their own state, here's the problem. Poles get their own state. They've got 3 large minority groups: Jews, Germans, Ukrainians. They're all second-class citizens in the new Polish state. So the grievances are created by the Treaty of Versailles and by Woodrow Wilson. And it's true in Czechoslovakia, what a hybrid operation that is. You see what I mean? The Czechs, the Bohemians, the Slovaks with minority groups. And I've always been amazed that Wilson did that, because our country's based on pluralism. And we took a different solution to the European problem. Sometimes I may not be being fair to Wilson, but in his heart he's a segregationist. And he's a Virginian. And I've always been suspect that might have influenced his decision about states being created on an ethnic basis. But I've harped enough about that. So what happens? Of course, the Germans do the invasion. Hitler's not bluffing. September 1st, 1939, World War II starts. And, of course, the Poles fight bravely. Historians, Bzura is a battle that takes place in northern Poland where the Poles did reasonably well, but the Poles cannot resist the Germans at this time. And while blitzkrieg is overrated, if some of you follow the military historians who come from the Command and Staff College, we're all good friends. And blitzkrieg has probably been overrated. Still, the use of tanks and armored divisions are new, and the Poles don't stand, I'll use Henry as an excuse again here, a snowball's chance in hell. And so they hold out for 6 weeks. Poland goes down in 6 weeks. But it's not the first air raids that took place on a city, but bombing an open city like Warsaw is a horrific event. And we should stop and talk about bombing a little bit too, because the Brits fear it, the French fear it. There was an Italian air theorist with a French name of Douai in the 1920s who argued the bomber always gets through. Now that will prove not to be true too, as you know about the Schweinfurt raid by Americans in 1943. The bomber doesn't always get through, but it was a belief that was widely held that in fact air power would be devastating, cities would be thoroughly destroyed. And of course they are, but it's in Spain that those cities are first. How many of you have seen Guernica? The tapestry that was done by our famous French artist. This is probably an apocryphal story, but it's too good to pass up. Supposedly Picasso didn't leave Paris. And worked in a studio after the Germans occupied France. And supposedly, 2 German officers went to see Picasso's studio, and hanging on the wall, supposedly, was Guernica. And they said to Hitler, they said to Picasso, did you do this? And he said, no, you did. I doubt it, no, but it's too good a story to pass up. And then they probably confiscated it. No, rolled it up and took it home anyway. You know, we've got a new movie coming out about that. So anyway, we'll take a look at Poland. This is the march that takes place. Hitler went to Warsaw by train. His general, one of his generals, said to him, he said, "Mein Führer, ich gebe Warschau. My Führer, I give you Warsaw." As a present, and bowed to him like that. And Hitler came on, you know, almost like Roman conquerors. It doesn't seem like that would be probable in 1939, but maybe it was probable in 1939, and I don't think it's probable in 2014. So, but in any event, here we get this is actually in the Czech Republic, and I better speed this up. I should have probably speeded this up, but this is Nomun Han, and you can get some idea of the size of the operation. It's not a little battle. This is a major conflict in which the Japanese get a real lesson in, you know, part of the reason why, while we're back on this subject a little bit, the Japanese army in the 1930s was split between those people who thought that they should have a great infantry army. You know, the French like this too, you know, the old poilu in French, the good old foot soldier. And of course, the good old foot soldier is obviously still necessary, but so is the new technology. So a part of the Japanese army hated tanks and armor divisions, and they argued repeatedly, Japanese spirit will overcome Western materialism. Well, I would guess some had a rethink in the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's not exactly the case. So this is an effort, as I said, 2 Japanese infantry divisions against 5 armor divisions. You get the idea. Here's some pictures. These are Soviet Mongolian troops that are involved in the conflict. I looked for some on the Japanese side, but couldn't find them. And of course, we should talk a minute. America had been trying to aid China ever since the war started in 1937 at Marco Polo Bridge. And we'll talk about this with the Russo-Finnish War, but, you know, we had passed in 1935 and 1936 the neutrality laws. And this is a problem for Franklin Roosevelt and a problem for our allies. It's based on our experience in World War I. Why did America get involved in World War I? Well, part of the feeling was, of course, it was a conspiracy theory. It was the ammunition makers that drug us into World War I. I think that has very little credibility, but it was hotly believed by millions of Americans. And at the same time, we loved Chiang Kai-shek and the idea of a free China. And Chiang Kai-shek was nominally a Methodist. And of course, his wife, Madame Chiang, graduated from Wesleyan, Vassar, I think, and had grown up in Atlanta, Georgia, and was married to some very influential Chinese. And so, amazingly, you know, the question is, who really supported China? And the main support from China really came from the Midwest, from the American Midwest. You would think it would be the 2 coasts, but it's not, but it's because of the missionary connection that was so powerful in China. And I think some of you may remember that, how many missionaries, hospitals. That's being looked at again historically too, and the missionaries are getting a relook, which I think is important. American missionaries started 21 women's colleges in China. We're going to get a new look at this. I think we're going to get a whole new look at Chinese history in the next 5 or 6 years, which is important. But this is a famous poster by Martha Sawyers, who was a famous artist and a war correspondent during the war. And she did most of the posters for United Relief. And of course, it's the Luces at Time magazine who are the big supporters of China Relief. We can't give them any arms and ammunition. It's against the law. Neutrality law said you have to come to America in your ships, pay for it in cash, and carry it home. Cash and carry is the only way we can sell you anything if you're a belligerent. But the president had the right to decide who was a belligerent. He did not choose to do that in the China case, so we sold them agricultural surplus. Now that helps a little bit because it helped feed the Chinese army and they could take other monies to buy ammunitions from other people. Amazingly, Chiang Kai-shek in the 1920s and 30s had bought a tremendous number of German equipment. The Germans were big on sponsoring Chiang Kai-shek in the 1920s during the Weimar years. You can ask questions. Now, here we go. In 1939, This is September 3rd. Hitler invaded on September 1st. Britain and France couldn't get their act together. And there's a flurry of diplomatic correspondence and back and forth between Paris and London about what to do. The British say, we have to honor our commitment. Even if you don't come with us, we will declare war. The French say, we're having trouble in the Chamber of Deputies. We think it'll pass. We're not sure. And then they ask the question, okay, if we declare war, what do we do? And this is a difficult problem. They can't get it together. Britain declares war at 11 o'clock in the morning on September 3rd, and the French can't do it till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Hitler's elated. They can't get it together. He doesn't have to fear an attack, probably on the Western Front. The French do honor their commitment and attack. There's about, inside the French border along Alsace-Lorraine, the West Wall had been built, a kind of Maginot Line on the German side. You know, the French, of course, had the Maginot Line on the other side. But they invade in about the wall is actually about 7 or 8 miles inside the border. And they attack 3 or 4 miles inside the border, so they don't hit the West Wall, but they're taking German territory. Now, most of that territory had been mined, and so the French, who are terrified of mines, drive herds of pigs through the minefields as part of their operation of invading Germany. Then they make a statement that they've taken something like 150 square miles of German territory. They have, but there aren't any Germans on it. So that's and they don't hit the West Wall. Had they hit the West Wall, in 1939, France has more soldiers, more airplanes, and more tanks. Now, they're not coordinated, and they're not in armored divisions like the Germans are, so who knows? You know, if frogs had wings, but it would be fascinating to know what would have happened had, in fact, the French. And, of course, the French are reluctant to go along with the British because it's the French that are going to have to hit the German border, not the British. But the British do transfer part of their army. Great Britain has always had a small standing army and does have a very small one in 1939. So they do transfer troops to France, and then, you know, we'll talk about what happens after that. I've always loved this photograph of holding up all the different newspapers about the invasion. This is by a very famous Jewish American artist, Arthur Zyk. S-Z-Y-K, Polish by origin, and all during the war he did vicious cartoons of the Nazis, really well done ones. He likes to work almost in Persian miniatures with a lot of gold leaf. That's what he's influenced mostly by, and some of the Jewish tradition in painting as well. But I only gave you one of them, but I have dozens of his drawings and of Polish soldiers and of Poland at war. And of course, America immediately, look, you know, in 1939, Chicago is the second largest Polish city in the world. And Chicago, once again, is almost the second largest Polish city in the world. How many of you go to Chicago, do North Milwaukee? Now, I'm the only one who goes up there all the time. All right, that neighborhood is growing and growing and growing because with the fall and the opening up of the Warsaw Pact, tremendous number of Poles have migrated both to the United States and to Ireland. Ireland now has a significant Polish population. But in any event, I've always loved these posters. W.T. Benda came to America from Poland after the turn of the century, and he did posters in World War I. And you can tell how influenced he is by World War I art. Look how beautiful the women and children are. And if you look at the World War I posters and look at Christie's posters, they're very much like that. And so he's carried that over into the World War II period. He did this for the Chicago Rada Polonia Amerykańska. It is in Polish, the big Polish aid organization out of Chicago. And he did these posters for them, a series of 11 of them. They're really big. They're about 36 by 44. And I've always been very fond of them. There are 11. I own 8 of them. I'll probably die before I get the other 3, but you know, you've got to have a goal. So in any event, here we have German plans for the invasion of Poland. And how did they do it? They used, what is the German army good at? All during the war. Why are so many people intrigued by the German army? And it's because they do operations so well. Let's discount the fact they're Nazis. I understand that. They're not the good guys. But the German army has been masterful in operations clear back to Frederick the Great. And one of the reasons why you have to have some admiration for the German peoples as well as the Russians, the German tribes are trapped on a flat plateau in the middle of nowhere. And they managed how do they survive in the great wars in Europe? And one of the ways is through operations and through mobility. And so really the German army in World War II is a modern version of Frederick the Great's army. And they're good at it. What are they terrible at? Strategic thinking and logistics. And what eventually does them in? Strategic thinking and logistics. But in operations, they're brilliant. I mean, look, even towards the end of the war, Eisenhower has told everybody and made bets amongst his officers, the war will be over by Christmas 1944. Who can anticipate the Battle of the Bulge? A masterful, misconceived strategic operation brilliantly conducted late in the war by the Germans, which nobody thought they could do. So in any event, this is what they're particularly good at. I have to watch my time here very carefully because we could go till midnight if you want to. I love this topic, as you can tell. Warsaw's bombed. The German army, too, it's always been after the war. The SS did it, the Wehrmacht didn't do it. We didn't have responsibility for atrocities. The Wehrmacht is utterly complicit in atrocities, and Wehrmacht units, and particularly Waffen-SS units, began to commit atrocities the day they invade Poland. They'll burn entire villages and shoot the inhabitants, and this is in 1939. And what's amazing, we debated that historically until the last 10 years. It's just amazing how long myth can prevail in the face of evidence. This is one of my favorite. We'll do this, and then I'm going to have to open this up to questions. Julian Bryan was a young Jewish boy whose parents gave him a trip to Europe in September 1939. Really good timing on their part, right? He got on the train in Bucharest, Romania, the night before the invasion took place. And he arrived in Warsaw the next morning just as the first plane struck. And he had his camera with him, and he took some of the finest photographs of the invasion of Poland that have been taken. This is of a young boy saving his bird during the bombing. This is one of my favorite tragic photographs. This photograph is called Sisters. And Junker, Ju-87 Stuka has strafed the civilians and killed the sister. But I think it's a powerful photograph. Doesn't get seen a lot anymore. Now, we'll do quickly 1 minute to do the Russo-Finnish War, and then I'm going to have to open this up to questions. But, the Russo-Finnish War, the Russians are worried about Leningrad, the possibility of it being under siege. It's too close to Finland, they think. They want some Finnish territory. They put the heat on. The Finns say, no. We're not the Czechs. We're not the Poles. The Poles fight, the Czechs don't. We're not going to do it. Negotiations break down. November 30th, the Soviet Union invades Finland. And it becomes a war. This is what happens after Hitler invades Poland and things settle down? Well, that winter period is called the Drôle de Guerre in French. Cynically, people called it Sitzkrieg rather than blitzkrieg, the Twilight War. So all attention is on Finland. And the Finnish army fights brilliantly. Now, the great mistake is the Russians used reserve troops they'd calling up in the Leningrad district that weren't very good. They had a lot better divisions, particularly Zhukov in the Far East, who's in the process of moving back towards Moscow. But the Finns inflict terrible casualties on the Russians. In Raeti Road, they destroy 2 complete divisions, Russian divisions in the snow. They use a tactic called Modi. We don't have time to talk about that tonight, but I love this poster because it violates American neutrality law. Fighting Finns for Finland, and they wanted to give them airplanes. I have sheets where you could buy an airplane all the way down to 1 bullet to help the Finns. Interestingly enough, Teddy Roosevelt's son, who was later killed in Normandy in 1944, organized a group of fighters to go to Finland and fight on the Finnish side. It's sort of as if you missed the Spanish Civil War and you wanted to fight on the other side, here was another chance to fight for the Finns. The Finns eventually cannot hold out, and we'll look at some slides. And by March 11th, which is just about 4 months into the war, the Finns sign an agreement, give up the territory, and cut a deal with the Russians. But we did an Iran-Contra deal that's not had enough attention. I'll write an article on it eventually. These are Brewster Buffaloes. Well, they're not a very good aircraft, but they were frontline aircraft in 1939. And how did they get to Finland? And the answer is Roosevelt violated the neutrality law. We could sell surplus equipment for cash. So he had the Navy decommission aircraft on the Yorktown aircraft carrier, picked up by Swedish pilots who flew them to Iceland, picked up by Finns who flew them, to Finland. How did they get the money to pay for them? We sold agricultural surplus, which was legal, to the Swedes, who put it on the international, the Swedes bought it, actually it was transferred to the Finns first. They put it on the international market in London, not in America. The Swedes bought it and gave the cash to the Finns to buy arms and ammunition. So Roosevelt violated the law on numerous occasions to help the Finns. I love this poster. And this is the image of the heroic Finnish soldiers fighting in their camouflage. Temperature got down to about 35 degrees below zero. And the Russians couldn't keep warm. Russian snipers, there's a Finnish sniper who killed 851 Russians. If you lit a match, you were dead. They dug big pits, had fires in them, stoves in them, and the Russians are out there freezing to death without the right winter equipment. Hitler drew the long conclusions very quickly. July 4th, 1939, Lou Gehrig retires. This is a marvelous picture. America, is peeking out of the Depression. We don't want to go to war. We don't want to have anything to do with it. It looks like there's a new life for us. America's been in depression since 1929. Agriculture's been in recession and on a downward trend since 1919, since the end of World War I. We don't want anything to do with it. Great year for film. Wizard of Oz is released. Which, of course, for all Kansans, every time I go to New York or Europe, people ask me how Dorothy is. I won't tell you my response. Well, I will. I say, it's just tragic. She died of AIDS. I just get tired of hearing about Dorothy. All right. I'm not sure they think that's funny, but you did. Thank you. And Seabiscuit, bad year in 39, but Seabiscuit was the horse of the year before and then came back and won all the awards in 1940. A great year for books. John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath came out, Agatha Christie's, and then there were none. The World's Fair is booming. And interestingly, the countries that had been pressured or conquered by both Russia and by Germany keep their pavilions open as a symbol of hope. The Polish pavilion, Lithuanian pavilion stay open at the World's Fair. We've got other good things. I just put this poster in here because I have to. I'm from Iowa and a Grant Wood fan, and this is the only poster that Grant Wood did during World War II for Bundles for Britain. On that note, I've gone over my time. We're set up a microphone here, and if you'll come down in front and want to ask me questions, I'll try to answer them, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. You have been a pleasure. Let's see what my questions are.
Thank you for the posters. They were wonderful.
Thank you.
I was interested in knowing what was the response to the posters for relief for China, for Poland, for...
Well, let me hear the first part again.
Okay. There were so many posters asking for relief.
Yes.
They were in the United States.
Yes.
What was the U.S. response to
Yes, she said there were so many posters asking for relief. What was the response? Well, of course, most of the ethnic groups that had difficulties, the Czechs, the Poles, got off. You noticed that all the posters, well, you wouldn't notice because I didn't show you one that had it on it, but none of them have National War Fund at the bottom. And what happened in both World War I and World War II is that the number of groups that were aiding people in distressed parts of Europe proliferated wildly. And they had to get a registration from the Department of State, which most of them did, but there was no coordination between them. So the U.S. government said in January 1942, there can only be one relief agency for each of the countries, and we'll do a national drive every single year opposite let me think, it's still around, the other big drive that takes place every year in the spring. And then in the fall, they do the relief drives. And each of the agencies could do their own posters, but they had to be marked National War Fund. This set off war in the relief agencies because now all of them had to get together. And because European politics are so difficult, this proved to be a problem. Let me give you an example very quickly. World War II in many ways, is a war between the left and the right, and a civil war in each of the countries in which it's fought. That ugly aspect shows up its head in relief agencies. What about Yugoslav relief, which is torn between those who supported Mihailovic and those who supported the communists? The New York and the Chicago Poles go to war with each other over who's going to run the organization. Chicago Poles are bigger, have more money, they prevail. The New York Poles go independently and don't participate in the National War Fund. So I'm anxious to write this book. I'm ready. I've been working on it for 8 years. I'm ready to write this book. So in a couple of years, I'll answer that question more thoroughly. Other questions? Anybody? All right, then, one in the back. Can you come up to the mic? Yep. If you would, please, because there's not a mic to pass around to you. Otherwise, we could deal with it that way. Please.
This is a quick question. I'm wondering about the worth of the poster by Grant. He lived very few years. And so his etchings are very expensive, much more expensive than Benton's. Grant Wood. Oh,
the posters?
Yeah, the last.
Yeah, those posters are most of those posters are in the $3,000 to $3,500 category. You might pick up I'll pay any price. So I think I paid $3,500 for the Grant Wood. They're hard to find. I've been looking one for 20 years and only ever found one. And so I jumped on it from a small dealer in Connecticut. Any other questions? Please. Please.
There's a relatively large ethnic German population in the United States.
Yes.
How were they acting leading up to the war?
Yes. You know, that's a real problem in World War I, the big German population. And Woodrow Wilson threw the editor of the German newspaper in jail, along with the head of the Socialist Party in jail. But by World War II, that's not a problem for the German-American community, except some in places in New Jersey and Orange County, California. The German-American boomed. They did have a rally. Some of you may have seen the pictures that took place in Madison Square Garden, but they're really pretty insignificant. There were some Germans interned during the war, not only Japanese. There were some Italians and Germans rounded up and held in New York during the war. Nobody's ever done a good book on that either, so there's more things to be done. Please, sir.
Thanks for taking my question. My question, about 10, 15 years ago, there was it made the mainstream media that Swiss banks had been complicit in basically keeping and aiding the Nazis through keeping looted gold and other reserves from World War II.
Oh, we were complicit?
No, the Swiss banks were. I mean, you remember that scandal?
Yeah, there were things transferred, and there were Jewish assets that were transferred, and that's, I think, mostly been worked out, and the Swiss have paid reparations. But no, there isn't any doubt that a lot of people transferred assets to Switzerland.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My question is, as far as I've read and heard a lot about American companies, such as even including Ford Motor Company and IBM.
Yeah, the question is about IBM and Ford complicity with Germany and that sort of thing. I think that's probably a little overrated. There isn't any doubt that we're a neutral country, and there are many American companies doing business right up until 1941.
Okay. Well,
all right, you know what I mean. We're a neutral country, so in fact that it's legal to do business with those countries as long as you're not violating neutrality laws and as long as you're not, providing military equipment directly. It gets to be a little tricky because if you're selling flywheels, and flywheels can be used in tanks, you get the idea. But yes, it's problematic. Please, sir.
To what extent, if at all, were World War I and World War II a continuation of the Napoleonic Wars?
You have asked a $64,000 question. All right. Is World War II a direct result of World War I? Kind of.
And the Napoleonic?
Napoleon. Yeah, the answer would be kind of. But, while there's a relationship between the two, in many ways they're not directly related. They're a new conflict, although certainly Hitler uses World War I. Here's the reason I say that is, people on the lip of time have to make decisions. And every single year people make decisions. And when we look back, we tend to build pathways that may never have been there, because it's open. The other morning I was on Sunday morning television, and the question was, does history repeat itself? And the interviewer looked shocked when I said no. I said, there are patterns to be perceived. History is extraordinarily valuable. I say this: it expands the range of your existential choices. But you know what I mean. Just because people, let me make it very simple. Just because in the past 9 times in a row people went to the right and won, there's still 50-50 chance on the 10th time if you go to the right, you're going to lose. And so you can't foresee how those different decisions are actually going to come out ahead of time. There's no doubt World War I is an important factor in World War II, but I don't think it's the only one.
What about the Napoleonic War?
Well, I'll be honest. I don't know enough about the Napoleonic Wars to answer that question. Otherwise, I would be happy to do that. Anybody else? Any concluding question? All right. Thank you very, very much. I've enjoyed it.